On the 30th of October, 1995, a solicitor in London sat down after a meeting and wrote up what had been said in it. That is not remarkable. Solicitors do it every working day of their lives, in every firm in the country, and almost none of those records is ever read by anybody outside the file. 2 years later, the woman who had spoken in that room died in a car crash in Paris. Now, what she had said is the part everybody knows, and it is the part I intend to handle carefully, because it has been investigated more thoroughly than almost anything else in modern British life, and it has been answered. That question is closed. I will show you exactly how it was closed, and I will not be reopening it. The part that was never satisfactorily settled is something else entirely. It is where that piece of paper went afterwards, because it went into a safe at New Scotland Yard, and it stayed there for 6 years, and the reasons given for putting it there are still being argued about by serious and reasonable people who agree on absolutely everything else in this story. That is our subject tonight. Not what a frightened woman believed, what an institution did with the record of it. Hello and welcome. I am Richard, and this is Richard Valentin. I want to set out 3 things before we begin, and I would ask you to hold me to all of them. The first, this episode concerns a woman who is no longer here and 2 other people who died alongside her. I will speak about them with the restraint that deserves. I will not be describing the crash, not the road, not the vehicle, not the moments before or after. Those details serve no purpose in what we are examining, and there are family members alive who have had to live with them being repeated for nearly 30 years. The second, I am going to tell you what the official investigations concluded, and I will do so now rather than saving it for a dramatic moment near the end, because saving it would be a technique, and this is not a topic for techniques. A Metropolitan Police inquiry called Operation Paget examined the allegations of conspiracy in enormous detail and found no evidence supporting them. A subsequent inquest, sitting with a jury under a senior judge, returned a verdict of unlawful killing arising from grossly negligent driving. Both of those processes considered the note we are going to discuss. Neither found it changed the picture. I accept those findings. I am not going to trade in the alternative. I am not going to hint at it. And if you have come here hoping for that, you are in the wrong place, and I would rather tell you now than waste your evening. The third thing is what we are actually doing instead. There is a real and open question in this story, and it does not require anybody to believe in a conspiracy. It is this. When a police force receives a document from a dead woman's lawyer recording that she had feared for her life, and it decides to file that document rather than act on it, is that a defensible professional judgment, or is it a serious error? Reasonable people have answered that differently, under oath, in a courtroom. I will put both answers to you as strongly as I can and then decline to choose between them, because on this one, I do not think my opinion is the useful thing I can offer you. Let us begin with the document itself and with why it existed at all. When a solicitor meets a client, the ordinary professional practice is to write up afterwards what was discussed. This is called an attendance note. It is not a formality, and it is not optional in any well-run firm. The reason is straightforward. Memory decays and disputes arise. If a client later says she gave one instruction and the solicitor acted on another, the note made on the day is what settles it. It is contemporaneous, which in legal language means made at or near the time rather than reconstructed later, and that single quality is what gives such a record its weight. So a solicitor's note is not a diary entry, and it is not a private reflection. It is a working document created for the protection of both people in the room. Which brings us to that particular afternoon. The meeting took place at the solicitor's offices on the 30th of October, 1995. Present were the Princess of Wales, Lord Mishcon, who was her personal legal advisor, and by then a man in his 80s with a long career behind him, her private secretary at the time, and other solicitors from the firm. She told them she had been warned by sources she described as reliable, whose identities she would not give, that efforts were being made to remove her from the scene. She indicated a possible time frame within the following months. She raised the possibility of a car accident, and she raised the alternative that she might be injured in a way designed to leave her appearing mentally unwell. I have described that as plainly and as briefly as I can, and I will move on, because dwelling on it is exactly the thing I said I would not do. Lord Mishcon wrote his note. It went into the file. And so far as anybody has ever established, nothing further happened for the next 22 months. There is a term worth having here, because it explains a good deal of what follows, and most people meet it only as a phrase in courtroom dramas: legal professional privilege. The principle is that what a client tells her lawyer belongs to the client rather than to the lawyer. It cannot be disclosed without her permission, and it cannot ordinarily be compelled by a court. The reason for the rule is not to protect lawyers. It exists so that people can speak to their advisors with complete candor, because a legal system in which clients edit themselves is a system that produces bad advice and worse outcomes. Now, the complication. That protection does not simply evaporate when a client dies. It passes, broadly speaking, to those who stand in her place. Which means a solicitor holding a sensitive note about a deceased client is not free to do whatever he judges best. He is holding something that is not his on behalf of somebody who can no longer instruct him. Keep that in mind when we reach the following autumn, because it is why a very experienced lawyer approached the police in the particular manner he did, and it is a constraint that most accounts of this story leave out entirely. Now, before we go any further, I need to draw a distinction that the entire rest of this episode depends on, and it is one that gets collapsed constantly. There are two completely different propositions here. The first is that a document exists recording that a woman said certain things on a particular day. That proposition is established beyond any argument. The note is real, it was produced in evidence, and multiple people who were in the room confirmed its accuracy years later. The second proposition is that what she said was correct. That is a different claim entirely, and it is the one that was investigated for years and rejected. Let me put that another way, because it is worth more than one pass. If you write down tonight that you believe your house will be burgled next month, and next month your house is burgled, the document you wrote proves that you feared it. It does not prove that you knew anything. Fear and knowledge produce identical paperwork, and only investigation can tell them apart. A record of a fear is not evidence that the fear was well-founded. It is only evidence that the fear was held. Those two things get treated as the same thing constantly in the coverage of this story, and they are not remotely the same thing, and if you take only one idea away from tonight, I would like it to be that one. Let me tell you something about how I prepared this episode, because I think you should know what I chose not to look at. There is an enormous amount of material available about this subject. Some of it is careful and sourced. A great deal of it is not, and a portion of it is aimed squarely at people who are grieving or frightened and looking for an explanation. I read the official material, the inquiry findings, the inquest reporting, the accounts of what witnesses said under oath. I deliberately did not read the rest, and I did not read it for a reason that is not squeamishness. Once you have absorbed that sort of material, it colors the language you reach for without your noticing, and you end up implying things you did not intend to imply. So if this episode feels narrower than others you may have seen on the subject, that is a choice rather than an oversight. Now to what happened after her death. She died on the 31st of August, 1997. I will leave it there. 18 days later, on the 18th of September, Lord Mishcon went to New Scotland Yard. He met the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Paul Condon, and an Assistant Commissioner, David Venice, who then had responsibility for royalty protection. He read the note aloud to them, and he made a point of stating that he was there in a private capacity, not on behalf of his firm and not on behalf of any member of the family. Consider what that gesture actually means, because it tells you a great deal about the man and about his difficulty. A solicitor's file is confidential to the client. His client had died. He plainly felt that the police ought to know what she had told him, and he equally plainly felt uneasy about the footing on which he was telling them. Stating that he came privately was his way of resolving something that had no clean resolution. One of the solicitors present at the original meeting later told the inquest what she understood his motive to have been. He wanted it on the record that the note existed and that his client had said what she said. That is a modest ambition, and I think it is worth noticing how modest it is. He was not making an allegation. He was placing something where it could be found. A record was made of that Scotland Yard meeting, too. It noted the commissioner's view that the facts established up to that point pointed to a tragic set of circumstances, and it concluded with an undertaking. If suspicious factors ever emerged concerning the crash in Paris, The solicitor or his firm would be contacted. Then the note went into the commissioner's safe. Sir David Venice later explained his own part in it. He decided not to pass the material to his French counterparts, and his stated reason was that there was at that time no evidence the crash was anything other than a tragic accident. The jurisdictional position underneath that decision is worth setting out, because it is genuinely awkward and not widely understood. The deaths occurred in France, under the ordinary rules that made them a matter for the French authorities, and a judicial investigation had already been opened there under a system that works quite differently from ours. In France, an investigating magistrate directs the inquiry. British police had no standing to investigate a road crash on a Paris street, and no power to do so. So the material in London sat in a curious position. It related to a British subject, it was held by British officers, and it concerned an event over which those officers had no authority whatsoever. Passing it across would have been an act of cooperation rather than an obligation, and it would have meant handing a confidential legal record from a deceased client's file to a foreign judiciary. None of that makes the decision correct. It does mean that anybody describing it as a simple matter of picking up a telephone has not looked at the problem properly. Let me give you the numbers, because I think the arithmetic of this story does more work than the argument does. The note was written in October of 1995. It reached New Scotland Yard in September of 1997. It reached the coroner's desk on the 30th of December, 2003. 6 years and 3 months in a safe. And here is the figure that puts that in proportion. When the police inquiry that eventually examined it reported, the document ran to over 800 pages, involved 14 officers working for the better part of 3 years, and addressed something in the order of 175 separate allegations. So one institution spent 3 years and a very large amount of public money answering questions about a death. And a piece of paper directly relevant to the atmosphere around that death sat unexamined in the same building for twice as long before any of that began. I am not telling you what to conclude from those two numbers sitting next to each other. I am telling you they sit next to each other. So what filled those 6 years? In France, the judicial investigation ran its course and concluded at the end of the 1990s, finding that the crash was an accident caused by the driver. In Britain, the inquests that would ordinarily follow the repatriation of a body were opened and then adjourned, waiting for the French process, and then simply waited. And the note stayed where it had been put. A word about why the British inquests took so long to begin, because people often assume delay implies reluctance, and here it mostly did not. When a British subject dies abroad and the body is returned, a coroner in this country must open an inquest. Standard practice is to open it formally and adjourn it immediately, waiting for the investigation in the country where the death occurred to complete. Running two parallel inquiries into one event would produce confusion and possibly conflicting findings. So the adjournment itself was routine. What was not routine was its length. The French process finished at the end of that decade, the British inquest still did not resume, and the years accumulated without anybody being able to point to a single decision that caused them. There is one detail from this period that complicates the story considerably, and I want to give it its full weight rather than tuck it away, because it is the strongest single fact on one side of the argument. Lord Mishcon himself did not attach great importance to what he had recorded. That is not my characterization. It comes from the officer who later ran the inquiry, who interviewed him repeatedly, and who has said publicly that Mishcon had not given the matter much weight and had regarded his client, at the time, as unduly fearful. Sit with the difficulty in that. The one man best placed to judge what he had witnessed, a very senior lawyer who had known her, formed a view. And his view was that she had been frightened rather than correct. If you are a commissioner receiving that document from that man, with that assessment attached to it, the case for filing it looks materially different than it does from where we are sitting. There is one more thing about those years that I want to name plainly, because it is easy to miss. Nothing happened. That is the whole of it. Nobody reviewed the note. Nobody destroyed it either, which is worth saying, since it survived intact and was produced in full when it was eventually called for. It simply sat in a building where thousands of people worked, known to a very small number of them, while the individuals who had placed it there moved on to other posts and eventually out of the service altogether. From what we know of how large organizations behave, That is not sinister. It is ordinary. Institutional memory is held by people, and people leave. Then, in October of 2003, something surfaced from an entirely different direction. A newspaper published a letter said to have been written by the princess in the year after the meeting we have been discussing, in which she expressed a similar fear, in her own hand. It had been kept by a member of her household staff. That publication changed everything, and it changed it in a very specific way. It was no longer one lawyer's account of one conversation. It was now two documents from different sources recording the same concern. Whatever you think of the individual who released the second document, and opinions on that vary a great deal, the corroboration was real, and it was immediately obvious to everybody. The machinery moved quickly after that. The note in the safe was reviewed, legal advice was taken on what to do with it, and on the 30th of December it went to the royal coroner. A week later, on the 6th of January, 2004, the inquests were formally opened. And the coroner did something he was legally obliged to do. When allegations of a crime come before a coroner, he must refer them to the police. Allegations of conspiracy to murder had been made, most prominently and persistently by the father of the man who died alongside her. So the referral was made, and the police inquiry began. Think of it like a fire alarm that nobody disabled and nobody tested. The undertaking given in 1997 was that if suspicious factors ever emerged, the solicitor would be contacted. In other words, the system was designed to sound if something changed. What actually happened is that something did change, publicly, in a national newspaper, and the alarm did not go off by itself. It went off because a completely separate document turned up in the hands of a completely separate person and forced the question into the open. That is the difficulty with arrangements of that kind. They depend on somebody remembering, years later, that the arrangement exists. Now let us look at what the investigations actually did with the note once they had it. The police inquiry treated it seriously. The officer leading it has said publicly that it caused him considerable concern, that he interviewed Lord Mishcon on 3 separate occasions, and that he took further statements about it. Mishcon was by then a very old man, and he died before the inquest sat. The inquiry reported in December of 2006. Its conclusion on the central question was unambiguous. The deaths resulted from a tragic accident. There was no evidence of a murder conspiracy and no evidence of a cover-up by the intelligence services. Since we are about to discuss what the inquest did, let me explain what an inquest actually is, because a great many people assume it is a kind of trial, and it is nothing of the sort. An inquest does not determine guilt. Nobody is accused, nobody is prosecuted, and nobody can be punished by it. Its purpose is narrower and much older. It establishes who died, and where, when, and by what means. It is an inquiry rather than a contest, and the coroner leads it rather than opposing sides fighting each other across a courtroom. In cases of particular public importance, a jury sits, and the coroner may be a senior judge rather than a local one, which is what happened here. That combination is uncommon, and it signals how seriously the matter was being taken. The practical consequence, and this is the part that matters for us, is that an inquest can compel witnesses and examine documents across a very wide front, because it is not confined to proving a specific charge, which is precisely why the note was finally examined in that room in a way it never had been anywhere else. The inquest sat before a jury under a senior judge, hearing evidence for 6 months from the autumn of 2007. In April of 2008, the jury returned its verdict: unlawful killing, arising from the grossly negligent driving of the vehicle carrying them and of the vehicles pursuing it. The jury identified several contributing factors. It did not find a conspiracy. The note was examined in that courtroom. Witnesses who had been in the room in 1995 gave evidence. Senior officers were questioned about what had been done with it and why. And one detail that emerged there has stayed with me. The princess's own sister first learned of the note's existence through the police inquiry, years after her death. There was also a moment during the hearings that I think punctures the wider allegation more effectively than any report could. Counsel, working through the list of people who would have had to be complicit for the conspiracy theory to read that list aloud. It ran to intelligence services in more than one country, senior police officers in 2 jurisdictions, coroners, ambulance crews, pathologists, diplomats, hotel staff, members of the deceased's own family, and more besides. Some propositions collapse not because you refute them, but because you finish writing them down. So, the handling question. Both sides, as strongly as I can build them. The case that the decision was defensible runs like this. Put yourself in that office in September of 1997. A crash has occurred in another country. That country has jurisdiction and has opened its own judicial investigation. Everything established so far points one way. And a solicitor arrives in a private capacity with a note recording something his client said 2 years earlier, while telling you that he does not himself place much weight on it. What are you supposed to do with that? You cannot investigate a crash in Paris from London. You cannot hand a confidential record from a dead client's file to a foreign judiciary without careful thought about the legal basis for doing so. And you certainly cannot make it public, because publishing a document in which a woman voices fears about members of her own family, weeks after her death, with no evidence supporting those fears, would be an act of extraordinary cruelty toward people who had done nothing wrong. On this reading, filing it securely with an undertaking to revisit it was not concealment. It was the least damaging option available, and every alternative on the table that day was worse. Now the case that it was a serious error, and this is not a fringe position. It was argued in court by experienced counsel. As I read it, this case begins with the simplest possible observation. Somebody expressed a fear of dying in a particular manner. She then died in that manner. Whatever the probability of coincidence, the correct professional response to that sequence is to examine it and record why you have dismissed it, rather than to place it in a safe. Then there is the French point. An investigation was underway in another country into the deaths of 3 people. Material existed in London bearing on the state of mind and the circumstances of one of them. Whether or not it would have changed anything, the judgment about its relevance arguably belonged to the investigating authority rather than to a police force in a different jurisdiction. And the strongest version of this case makes an argument about consequences that I find hard to dismiss. In the absence of information, people invent it. 6 years of silence about a document that existed did not prevent speculation. It created the conditions in which speculation flourished. And when the document finally emerged, its emergence looked exactly like the thing its custodians had been accused of. Counsel for the family of the man who died alongside her put it as demonstrating a serious reluctance to have this properly investigated from the beginning. Notice what that argument does not require. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only that an institution, choosing the quiet option, produced a louder outcome than the noisy option would have produced. There is a further point on this side, which I think is the subtlest of the lot. The undertaking recorded in 1997 placed the burden in the wrong place. It said that if suspicious factors emerged, the lawyer would be contacted. But the lawyer was not conducting an investigation and had no means of knowing whether anything had emerged. The only people positioned to notice were the ones holding the document, and nothing in the arrangement obliged them to look. An undertaking that depends on the vigilance of the party with the least information is not really an undertaking. It is a way of closing a conversation politely. One more consideration, and it belongs to neither side, which is why I am putting it on its own. Everybody in this story was operating in the weeks and years immediately after an event that had produced an extraordinary national reaction. Judgment under those conditions is not the same as judgment in calm weather. Decisions get made by people who are tired, who are being asked 40 questions a day, and who cannot see which of those questions will matter in a decade. That is not an excuse. Senior officers are paid for judgment precisely because the conditions are difficult. But any assessment that imagines the decision being taken in a quiet room, with time to think and the benefit of everything we now know, is assessing something that never existed. So which is it? I said I would not tell you, and I am keeping to that. But I will tell you why I find the question genuinely difficult rather than merely balanced. What strikes me is that both cases are correct about different things. In my view, the defensible case is right that every option available in September of 1997 had a serious cost, including the option of doing nothing quietly. The error case is right that the cost of the chosen option was paid over the following decade by everybody, including the family the decision was arguably protecting. What neither side can do is tell you what would have happened on the road not taken. Nobody can run that experiment, And anyone who says confidently that disclosure in 1997 would have settled the matter is guessing. Let me leave you with the thing that generalizes, because it does generalize, and it has nothing to do with this family at all. Institutions are very good at deciding what to do with information that demands action. Ambulances get sent. Arrests get made. The systems for urgency are well built and well practiced everywhere. What institutions are consistently poor at is information that demands nothing in particular. A document that is troubling but not actionable. A concern that cannot be investigated but cannot honestly be dismissed. There is rarely a procedure for that, so it goes into a drawer, and the drawer is not a decision to conceal anything. It is the absence of a decision. An absence of decision is what the passage of time converts into something that looks like concealment, whether or not it ever was. That, to my eye, is the durable lesson here. Not who knew what, but that a filing choice made in an afternoon, for reasons that seemed sensible at the time, can end up being the thing a country argues about for a decade. Next time on this channel, we are going somewhere much older and considerably stranger. In 1969, this family let a camera crew inside for the first and only time. 30 million people watched what came out of it. It was shown a handful of times and then withdrawn, and it has stayed out of circulation ever since. Not because it failed, but because of what a number of people believe it succeeded in doing. We have spent this evening on a document that was locked away. Next time, a film that was. Before you go, I would value your thoughts, and I would ask you to keep them within the boundaries I set at the start, as you have generously done before. Given everything we have walked through, where do you land on the handling question? If you had been sitting in that office in September of 1997, holding a note from a lawyer who told you he did not think much of it, what would you have done with it, and what would that decision have cost? I read every comment, and on this subject I would rather hear careful disagreement than easy agreement. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you for the seriousness you bring to episodes like this one. Look after yourselves, be gentle with the people around you, and I will see you next time.